Do you know, when a nation launches a war, massacres tens of millions of people, and turns half of Asia into a living hell, how much do they have to pay in reparations after being defeated? The answer is quite fascinating. To their primary victims, they did not have to pay a single dime, and it goes beyond that. The victorious nations actually came with handfuls of cash, begging to help them build factories and revitalize their economy. This is not some cheap science fiction movie. This was Japan after the Second World War. Think back to 1945. The Americans vowed to uproot Japanese industry entirely, ensuring they would live in conditions worse than any of the nations they had invaded. But what happened? In less than 3 years, those exact same American politicians changed their tune. They claimed that, for the sake of world peace, we must transform Japan into the wealthiest nation in Asia. Today, we are not going to talk about grand political correctness. We are only going to look at the distribution of interests. Let us tear away the affectionate veil of history and see exactly how Japan managed to orchestrate this unbelievable economic comeback, stepping over mountains of bones and blood. Looking back at history, a defeated nation that has been beaten into total submission in a full-scale war usually faces a long and deeply painful era of economic darkness, just like Germany after the First World War, crushed so heavily by the astronomical Treaty of Versailles that it could barely breathe, even triggering hyperinflation where you had to push a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. However, our neighbor Japan, after being beaten black and blue in World War II, somehow managed to rapidly resurrect itself. How could a defeated nation, with hands dripping in blood debts, magically secure an exemption from massive reparations to its primary victims? Why is it that throughout the last century, and even up until a dozen years ago, they were able to live such comfortable lives? The water here is deeper than you could ever imagine. Over the next little while, I will take you on a journey starting from the moment Japan surrendered in 1945, analyzing every step up until their economic bubble burst, leading to their lost 30 years. This is a complete modern history of Japan. We will watch them build towering skyscrapers, host lavish banquets, and finally see how this building, constructed from the flesh and blood of others, came crashing down. As everyone knows, in August 1945, the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki unleashed a blinding flash of light. These 2 flashes completely blinded Japanese militarism, yet they also unexpectedly illuminated a smooth path for Japanese politicians to find a new patron. After Japan surrendered unconditionally, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, Douglas MacArthur, descended upon Tokyo with absolute authority. He set up his office straight in the Daiichi Life Insurance building, effectively becoming the supreme overlord of Japan. In all fairness, the micromanagement of this man on the battlefield often made people sweat for him. His dark history of being chased and beaten by Japanese forces in the Philippines was so bad that even Hollywood screenwriters could not spin it. But we have to admit, MacArthur had an incredibly sharp, almost animalistic instinct for domestic maneuvering and political tactics. He might not have been a perfect general, but he was absolutely a top-tier politician who deeply understood the game of power. When this elite politician first stepped onto Japanese soil, what kind of mess was he facing? Let us first look at the diplomatic attitude. In the very beginning, the Allied stance toward Japan was crystal clear: blood for blood. In late 1945, the United States sent the highly authoritative Poly mission to Japan to assess the issue of reparations. Just how tough was the official American stance back then? They explicitly instructed that the reconstruction of Japan must be borne by the Japanese themselves, and they strictly forbade any form of aid that would allow the Japanese standard of living to surpass past that of the nations they had brutalized. The Poly mission even proposed dismantling all of the remaining heavy industrial equipment of Japan, treating it as scrap metal to offset their debts, effectively devolving Japan back into an agrarian state that could only farm the land. This severe attitude plunged Japanese society into deep panic and pessimism. Why? Because when you lose a war, you pay up. That has been the iron law since ancient times, and the sins Japan committed across Asia were simply too many. Just flipping open the ledger for China reveals an astronomical figure. Starting from the First Sino-Japanese War, ceding Taiwan, occupying the Liaodong Peninsula, annexing Korea, and for CI extracting an indemnity of 200 million taels of silver from the Qing Empire. When World War II broke out completely, it caused tens of millions of civilian casualties in China, along with incalculable property damage. According to initial estimates by American actuaries at the time, just to compensate China alone, Japan would have to cough up at least $20 billion. Please note, this is $20 billion in the 1940s, and it did not end there. The Philippines, Myanmar, Indonesia, and even the United States itself were all lining up waiting to collect. What was the state of the Japanese treasury back then? In short, it was so poor that even a mouse would leave with tears in its eyes. Their domestic industrial base had been firebombed into a blank slate, to the point where you could not even find an intact iron pot. You want them to pay up, honestly? Even if you scraped off and sold every inch of land in mainland Japan, you could not even cover the interest on this astronomical blood debt. Facing this absolute dead end, Japanese politicians demonstrated extreme flexibility. The strategy of people like Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida was brutally simple. They played the poverty card, wearing wrinkled suits. They clung to the legs of the Americans and cried for their lives. They would say, "Oh, great overlord, we truly have no money. Look at our factories. They have all been leveled by your bombs. If you dismantle our very last tools of production, tens of millions of Japanese will starve to death in the streets, and dealing with that aftermath will ultimately fall upon the American military." As a matter of fact, this desperate act actually worked on the Americans. Those American actuaries flicked their abacuses and realized the logic was flawless. If they completely destroyed Japanese industry, this group of farmers left with nothing but hoes could plant radishes for 100 years and still never pay off that astronomical debt. So, the American attitude began to show a subtle softening. Actually, as early as July 26, 1945, an opening was planted in Article 11 of the Potsdam Declaration. It permitted Japan to maintain those industries which would sustain her economy and allow the exaction of just reparations in kind. Translated into plain language, this meant, I allow you to rebuild factories and boost your economy. Just do not touch the arms industry. You need to hurry up and make money so you can pay off your debts. But the development of the situation quickly exceeded the expectations of everyone. This survival space, barely bought because they owed too much money, was about to be massively expanded by a much larger geopolitical game. In the end, Japan not only avoided paying that deadly, massive sum, but even welcomed huge investments of American cash. What bizarre reversal happened in the middle of all this? This entire story must begin with a democratic experiment driven by the Americans in Japan. As time went on, relying solely on the Japanese picking up bricks from the ruins to build factories meant this debt would not be paid off until the end of time. But by then, the attention of America had already begun to shift. Although the Second World War was over, another behemoth, the Soviet Union, was rapidly expanding its influence across Europe and Asia. The Americans looked around and realized that Asia was full of shattered, impoverished nations. The communist slogan of Taking down the rich and distributing the land had a fatal attraction for these bottom-tier citizens, who could not even afford to eat. The United States desperately needed a showcase, a model home to demonstrate to all of Asia just how superior American capitalism and democratic systems were. Looking around, a devastated yet completely American-controlled Japan became the perfect guinea pig. The American, as calculated would going to transform Japan into a shining, wealthy democratic nation, showing everyone in Asia that following the United States means enjoying the good life, while following the Soviet Union only leads to labor camps. And so they did. The Supreme Command of MacArthur began a radical structural surgery on Japan. The first to go under the knife were the traditional massive Japanese conglomerates, the zaibatsu. The Americans knew full well that these family-owned enterprises, controlling the economic lifeline of Japan, like Mitsui, Mitsubishi and Sumitomo, were the primary financial backers behind Japanese militarism during the war. Thus, the United States ordered the forced dissolution of these zaibatsu, attempting to break the monopolies and give small and medium enterprises some room to survive. Immediately following this was an agricultural land reform that impacts Japan to this day. Before the Second World War, the agricultural structure of Japan was highly deformed and feudal, with massive amounts of land concentrated in the hands of a few landlords. According to historical data, before the reform, the proportion of tenant farmers in Japan reached a staggering 46%. This meant that nearly half of the farmers worked brutally hard all year, only to hand over the vast majority of their harvest to the landlords, leaving themselves barely enough porridge to survive. This extreme wealth disparity was the perfect breeding ground for social unrest and radical ideologies. The Americans took one look and said, "This will not do. This is exactly the kind of soil the communists love." So the United States aggressively intervened, forcibly acquiring land from abs and landlords at incredibly low prices, and then reselling it to the landless, impoverished farmers. This operation was swift and decisive. In just a few short years, the proportion of Japanese tenant farmers plummeted to around 10%. Sounds inspiring, does it not? Sounds like a perfect benevolent policy. The Americans successfully achieved the goal of land to the tiller in Japan. But folks, the real world is never a fairy tale. This seemingly perfect reform, driven by American wishful thinking, eventually birthed a deformed monster that makes countless Japanese gnash their teeth. Today, wherever the Americans go, they carry an almost obsessive compulsion for democracy. They figured, since the land had been distributed, the farmers should organize their own democratic, self-governing bodies. So, they pushed for the establishment of local agricultural committees, encouraging farmers to hold assemblies and run elections. And the result? The Americans clearly underestimated the deep-rooted ability of the Japanese bureaucratic system to rebrand itself. Those formerly suppressed landlords and local conservative forces reacted very quickly. They immediately understood the rules of this American-style democratic game. They put on suits, and through elections and their existing social networks, they effortlessly seized control of these agricultural organizations. Ultimately, these scattered groups merged in 1947 into a massive entity known as the Japan Agricultural Cooperatives, commonly referred to as YA. Just how outrageous is this organization? Let us make a comparison. It is not just a simple farmers' mutual aid society. It is a complete and utter monopoly. It entirely controls the purchasing of Japanese agricultural products, not even sparing the sale of fertilizers and seeds. It even set up its own cooperative banks and insurance companies for the farmers at the bottom. If you do not join the cooperative, you simply cannot sell your vegetables. If you dare to resist, you might even face boycotts and isolation from the entire village. In this way, the cooperative legally drains the blood of Japanese farmers and consumers from all angles. And for Japanese politicians, the cooperative holds millions of ironclad rural votes in its hands. When election season rolls around, a single word from the upper management ensures the vote's obedient life flow into the ballot boxes. This means that across the entire Japanese political landscape, no matter how big of a shot you are, nobody dares to touch the slice of the cake that belongs to the cooperative. The moment anyone proposes importing cheap foreign agricultural products, the cooperative instantly launches a voting boycott, guaranteeing you will be packing your bags by tomorrow. So when you are in a Japanese supermarket and you see a peach selling for 5,000 yen, or ridiculously overpriced beef, please understand that this is truly not some touching craftsman spirit. It is the massive agricultural monopoly levying at all on every consumer in Japan. This has also led to a very absurd phenomenon in Japanese society today. Despite being a developed nation, ordinary citizens actually have to check the calendar and pick a special day just to eat fruit. Even for daily meals, the portions of meat and vegetables are pitifully small. This super monster that hijacked national policy with votes and made fruit unaffordable for the Japanese people is exactly the landmine the Americans planted with their own hands. To promote American-style democracy, the Americans created an uncontrollable Frankenstein in agriculture. But that was not what made the top brass in Washington break down the most. It was when they brought another flame of American democracy, union power, into the Japanese industrial sector, that they truly understood what it meant to drop a rock on their own feet. A dark comedy that would leave the American overlords sweating cold drops was about to unfold vigorously across major factories in Japan. Between late 1945 and 1946, the Americans successfully introduced the trade union law and the labor relations adjustment law. In Japan, this script was basically moved straight from the desks in Washington. Their logic was simple: since we want to counter the Soviet Union, we must show all of Asia how happy and dignified workers are under the capitalist system. We must grant Japanese workers the right to organize unions, bargain collectively, and even strike. In the imagination of the American lords, once Japanese workers received this massive gift of rights, they would weep with gratitude, salute portraits of General MacArthur, and then politely negotiate with the capitalists within the framework of democracy. But they truly did not understand Asia, let alone the extreme, binary nature of the Japanese character. In the Japanese dictionary, the middle path or knowing when to stop simply does not seem to exist. If you ask them to go right, they will sprint straight off the extreme right wing fascist cliff. Now the American patron was telling them to go left to promote democracy and protect unions. Great. The Japanese workforce would show them exactly what going left looked like once the power was unleashed. Compounded by the soaring prices and miserable living conditions in early post-war Japan, the entire Japanese society exploded like a boiling pot. When those left-wing leaders, who had been imprisoned for years, walked out of the prison gates, all of Japan treated them as heroes. Why? Because in that era of madness, this was the only group that had never colluded with the military regime. This made the Japanese Communist Party the only pure brand in the post-war ruins that had not been tainted by dirty water. As soon as these old leftists got out of prison, they moved faster than the American military, swiftly taking over the unions. From late 1946 onwards, red flags fluttered everywhere in Japan. The workers did not just demand pay raises, they even started playing an advanced game called production control. They would simply lock the factory doors, kick out the capitalists, and then the union would hold meetings manage production, and distribute the money themselves. Now General MacArthur was totally dumbfounded. He had wanted to build a beautiful showcase of democracy in Japan, but the foundation was barely laid before bright red flags were flying on the roof. How was this? Containing the Soviet Union. This looked more like they were preparing to wrap Japan up and hand it over to Stalin as a gift. This farce reached its climax in early 1947. At that time, a massive network of Japanese unions rallied nearly 3 million workers, preparing to launch an unprecedented general strike on February 1st. What does 3 million people mean? If the start button on this strike was actually pressed, the entire transportation network, communication systems, and power supply of Japan would be instantly paralyzed. The Japanese government could basically just pull down its shutters and declare bankruptcy. Just 9 hours before the strike was set to explode, MacArthur, who had previously talked big about protecting labor rights, finally tore off that affectionate veil and revealed his domineering double standards as the Supreme Overlord. He directly issued a directive from the Supreme Command, using the threat of military force to forcefully ban the strike. In that moment, Japanese workers suddenly realized the truth. The democracy gifted by their American patron came with a real period, and the final right of interpretation always belonged to the patron. Since the democratic experiment was pushing Japan straight into the arms of communism, the Americans immediately initiated the historically famous reverse course. They pivoted to help the Japanese government suppress the unions, purge left-wing elements, and later even established the National Police Reserve, which is the predecessor to the modern Japan Self-Defense Forces. But just using clubs for suppression was not enough. Japan was now like an unemployed, debt-ridden thug. Once he got hungry, he would inevitably run off to join the communists. America realized they had to get the Japanese economic engine running, and fast. The problem was, Japan still had that thick stack of astronomical reparation bills pressing down on its head. If all the money they earned had to be used to pay off debts, how could the Japanese economy ever take off? Just as the United States was frowning, trying to figure out how to help Japan dodge its debts, an old friend far across the strait delivered a massive gift that shook the world and unexpectedly changed the national destiny of Japan. Speaking of this, we have to pull our perspective back a little bit and look at the broader geopolitical chessboard of Asia at the time. In the late 1940s, the primary proxy the United States had placed its highest hopes on in Asia was not Japan at all, but rather Chiang Kai-shek, who was governing from Nanjing and later treated to Taiwan. The American shad poured oceans of financial aid and American equipment into his hands, hoping old Chiang could stabilize mainland China and serve as the front line for American containment of the Soviet Union in Asia. And the result, the performance of this man, mockingly called the Chief of Transportation, completely broke the top brass in Washington. From 1946 to 1949, the speed at which the Chinese Civil War shifted was beyond the imagination of any military expert. Old Chiang led millions of troops, equipped exclusively with American gear. Yet in just 3 short years, he played this incredible hand of cards entirely into the ground. The Americans watched from the sidelines, utterly stunned. They watched as massive amounts of surplus supplies and elite weaponry were generously handed over to his opponents. They watched as the internal corruption of his government spread incurably like cancer cells. By 1948, the Americans finally came to the painful realization that the great ship of Chiang Kai-shek had completely sunk. Counting on him to be the anti-communist breakwater in Asia was like carrying firewood to put out a fire. If you did not help, it was fine, but once you helped, the firepower of the enemy only grew stronger. The change of colors in mainland China was a bolt from the blue for the United States. In the American Cold War mindset, if China, the largest landmass in Asia, was lost, then the Soviet sphere of influence would push right to the edge of the Pacific Ocean. Extreme crisis is indeed the best catalyst for changing national policy. On January 6, 1948, U.S. Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal Delive read a globally shocking speech in San Francisco. This speech officially announced the immediate promotion of Japan from a prisoner of war to a guest of honor. Royal stated bluntly in his speech that, facing the new international situation, if Japan was to maintain political stability and champion freedom, its government must possess a healthy economy. He even clearly hinted at transforming Japan into a strong fortress to block communism. When these words came out, all the Asian nations that had been brutalized by Japan were dumbfounded. What do you mean by a healthy economy? This is a defeated nation that took tens of millions of lives. The victims are still starving in the ruins. And now you are saying you want to help this robber build its economy. But the Americans did not care about any of that. In their eyes, morality, when faced with realistic political interests, was cheaper than flyers on the side of the road. Once the official tone shifted, the capital on Wall Street caught the scent and moved accordingly. At that time, the American corporate world started a bizarre trend of buying the dip in Japan. These sure businessmen realized that while Japanese infrastructure was currently terrible, it had a massive labor force. Wages were incredibly cheap, and they were personally protected by the U.S. military. If they went in now to invest and foster the revival of Japan, once this pig was fattened up, the blood American corporations could siphon off would absolutely be hundreds of times greater than those rigid war reparations. The government wanted political leverage, the private sector wanted commercial profit, and the two hit it off instantly. Thus emerged a highly absurd historical scene. Japan, which should have been sitting in a jail cell reflecting deeply on its actions, suddenly found itself the darling in the palm of its American patron, the American Spiegel, searching the globe for excuses to help Japan default on its debts. But that was $20 billion of blood debt. China, the Philippines, Myanmar, and all those ravaged nations were standing in line waiting to get paid. The Americans may have been domineering, but they could not just take an eraser and wipe away this international bad debt, right? In order to forge Japan into the Asian anti-communist breakwater, the United States started scouring the world for legal justifications to help Japan evade its payments. It was like a village bully smashing up the entire village, only for the neighboring village chief to run over and say, well, for the sake of peace for everyone, let us just do a good deed and not make him pay. Does this logic not sound more magical than an absurd display? But under the Cold War dynamics of the 1950s, this was the bloody reality of international politics. At that time, the United States was the only superpower in the world whose mainland had not been touched by the fires of World War II, and its economy was surging against the trend. Its industrial output accounted for more than half of the global total, and it held nuclear weapons and dollar hegemony in its hands. In that era, the words of the American patron were the absolute gospel in the so-called free world. Moreover, many countries, desperate for post-war reconstruction, were eagerly looking forward to American economic aid. Faced with the United States acting generous at the expense of others, they truly dared to be angry but dared not speak, and could only hold their noses and play along. In September 1951, under the strong orchestration of the United States, representatives from 48 victorious nations gathered in San Francisco, preparing to sign the Treaty of San Francisco, which would determine the post-war fate of Japan. The most jaw-dropping part of this treaty was Article 14 regarding war reparations. Between the lines of this text, The Americans displayed incredibly masterful legal wordplay. The core spirit of the text was, in principle, we recognize that Japan has an obligation to pay reparations. But given the current economic capacity of Japan, it is simply insufficient to pay full reparations. While maintaining a viable economy, therefore, the Allied powers agreed to waive their claims for reparations against the state of Japan. I have to say, this move was played beautifully. They did not arrogantly declare that Japan absolutely did not have to pay. Instead, they framed it as, please be understanding. They are very poor right now. So for the greater good, everyone should voluntarily give it up. Under American co-I don't and inducement, many Western nations, including the United States itself, Britain, France, and Australia, successively signed the treaty, announcing they had waived their national reparation claims against Japan. After all, their own mainlands had suffered relatively little damage from the war, or they had already confiscated the massive overseas assets of Japan within their borders. Doing a favor for the American boss, why not? But folks, for those Asian nations that had been ravaged and riddled with holes by Japanese militarism, how could this debt simply be written off? The Americans themselves knew clearly that the blood debts owed to some countries were simply too deep, so deep that even the Americans were embarrassed to ask them to forgive. For example, the mass slaughter in Manila, the Philippines, that took 100,000 lives was still vividly remembered. For example, in Myanmar and Indonesia, countless resources had been plundered and civilians enslaved, so the United States left a backdoor in the treaty. If some countries really could not swallow this anger, you can go and privately negotiate reparations with Japan on your own. Thus we saw a very realistic contrast. Those Southeast Asian countries that had been beaten by Japan until their homelands were completely destroyed actually had very stiff spines. Although they attended the San Francisco Conference, they absolutely refused to compromise easily. The Philippines, Myanmar, Indonesia, and even South Vietnam, they grabbed Japan by the collar, negotiating and fighting every step of the way to the very end. This debt collection drama played out all the way through the late 1950s, and even into the 1960s. In the end, these countries forcefully compelled the Japanese government to cough up real silver and gold. According to historical records, Myanmar received $200 million. The Philippines received $550 million in goods and services. Indonesia received $230 million. And South Vietnam received $39 million. Although this money was still a drop in the bucket compared to their actual losses, at the very least, they clawed back a sliver of justice for their citizens. But the most unbelievable maneuver, one that makes the scalps of countless later generations of Chinese tingle with anger, was about to happen with the nationalist government, which at the time claimed to represent all of China. Let us pull the timeline back to the eve of the San Francisco Conference in 1951. The biggest political storm outside the venue at that time was, who would sign on behalf of China? Was it the newly established government in Beijing, or the Kuomintang that had retreated to Taiwan? During the Civil War, the United States and Britain argued fiercely over this issue. Britain had already recognized the Beijing government and argued that the Beijing delegation should be brought in. The United States, because it was heavily engaged in the Korean War with the mainland and the UN forces at the time, defended the Kuomintang in Taiwan to the death. Ultimately, the two sides could not reach an agreement. The result of their compromise was actually that neither of the two governments across the strait was allowed to attend the San Francisco Conference. This decision was undoubtedly a severe blow to Chiang Kai-shek far away in Taipei. He dreamed every day of counter-attacking the mainland. If he was even stripped of the qualification to sign the peace treaty with Japan, then what legitimacy did he have left? Internationally, where was his orthodox status? To rule Taiwan, to save his car-umbling regime, and to hold tightly onto the leg of the United States. Old Chiang made an extremely cold-blooded political calculation, with the United States pulling the strings and applying immense pressure. In 1952, Japan sent a delegation to Taipei, preparing to sign a separate Sino-Japanese peace treaty, also known as the Treaty of Taipei, with the nationalist government of Old Chiang. At the negotiating table, the Japanese representatives had originally prepared a whole set of rhetoric, and had even mentally prepared themselves for a massive financial bleed, intending to fiercely debate the reparations issue with the Taiwan side. But then, something happened that completely shattered the glasses of the Japanese delegates. The Kuomintang actually stepped forward and stated, to demonstrate the demeanor of a great nation, "We are willing to voluntarily waive our demands for war reparations from Japan." When these words were spoken, the Japanese representatives simply could not believe their ears. They had originally thought they were about to face a grueling negotiation of cutting flesh, but they never expected the other side to voluntarily put away the knife. Why was Old Chiang truly a living bodhisattva reincarnated? Of course not. He waived this astronomical reparation, which was enough to crash the Japanese economy all over again, solely for a political purpose that was of paramount importance to him, to exchange for Japanese recognition in the Treaty of Taipei that he was the sole legitimate government representing China. He used the blood, debts and suffering of countless people to buy an illusory certificate of orthodoxy, so that he could continue maintaining his ruling authority in Taiwan, so that the Americans would keep sending him dollars, and use the Seventh Fleet to help him defend the Taiwan Strait. So we really have to admire the political calculus of Principal Chiang. For the continuation of his own regime, he did not hesitate to push the historical trauma of the entire nation onto the gambling table of great power politics. Just as many historians later sharply commented, for the economic takeoff of Japan, they really ought to bow twice to Old Chiang. If it were not for his generosity in giving away the wealth of all Chinese people, Japan, burdened by that massive war debt, would have had to stay face down in the mud eating dirt for at least another 20 years. Alright, let us put personal emotions aside for a moment and return to the main economic storyline. Under the strategic cover of the United States, and through the political exchange of Old Chiang, Japan miraculously unloaded its heavy historical burden. The financial pressure on the Japanese government was indeed cleared out in an instant. But folks, having your debt reset to zero does not mean the economy of a country will instantly take off in place as if it took a magic pill to rebuild a pile of ruins into the second largest economy in the world. To truly strike it rich, just not paying your debts is not enough. You also need some highly precise, God-tier maneuvers and unbelievable historical opportunities. After that, what kind of tailwind did Japan catch next? What kind of script did the Americans hand them? How did Japan step by step reach a prosperity? Like oil pour it on a raging fire, only to finally crash into the abyss. These are the topics we will cover in the upcoming content. Alright, that is all for this episode. Remember to subscribe and hit the like button. I'm Eleanor Hayes, and I will see you next time.